Comrades, I'm not going to put a line today, I'm going to start a discussion, he said defensively. This is a talk about my reading of E.P.Thompson's recent book, Customs in Common, which I'll say something about in a minute. But when I sent the review article, which appears in the latest IS Journal to him, he wrote back and said, I think it's very fair, and you are clearly an anarchist. So there's a health warning attached to this. Already one comrade from my own district has said that he agrees with E.P.Thompson, since he's read the review article, and maybe a lot of you will also agree with E.P.Thompson by the end. So I hope the discussion will be more interesting than the talk. Let me say something very briefly about the book as a whole, because it is a wonderful book, and unfortunately it's £25. So we all have to hope that it will do quite well in hardback and sell to libraries, and then Penguin or somebody will bring it out in a format that comrades can afford. But if you have got a rich uncle and you want a really nice Christmas present, it is a smashing book. It's a series of essays which focuses on the 18th century class struggle in England. And the issues at stake in the class struggle in England in the 18th century are not just the standard of living of ordinary people, but as much as that, this is a world in which capitalism is advancing, in which the expropriation of the proletariat is taking place, in which land is being enclosed, in which people are fighting advancing capitalism. And they're fighting over the very shape of life, over the meaning of life, over morality and politics and the morality of economic life, if you like. And Thompson evokes this world and describes it and explores it in the most entertaining and beautiful way. I mean, all the virtues of some of his other books, where lots of people here probably have read The Making of the English Working Class, it's got all the virtues of that wonderful book. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the first two-thirds of the book, really for lack of time. His discussion of the struggle against enclosures, the struggles of crowds in marketplaces to try and control food prices, the struggle with the capitalist class in the new factories over the management of time, over how fast you have to work, over the arrival of the clock and the alarm clock and the time clock and all of those things. He presents a beautiful account of it, and I really haven't got any quarrels with two-thirds of the book. In fact, I just have admiration for it and recommend it and love it. And it doesn't pose really any political problems for us, I think, because what's involved is an account of people fighting back to defend their customary standards of living against an invading capitalist society, really. And it's an account of how they draw on a whole repertoire of customary methods of struggle in order to try and defend themselves. And it's brilliantly written, and as I say, I just recommend it. I've tried to give a little bit of the flavour of that part of the book in the review article, which you can have a look at. But in all of it, one of the things that Thompson stresses is that the people of England, in the towns and the villages up and down the country, England and Wales, and he's not very much on Scotland, nothing on Ireland, are trying to defend what he calls the moral economy. Against the political economy of the rising capitalist class, they are trying to defend what he calls a moral economy, which essentially is a more humane idea of human needs and how they ought to be met. That food prices ought to be kept down so that people can afford to eat. That the land ought not to be taken over and turned into exclusive property by the aristocracy and by the farmers and so on. That people ought to have the right to glean grain after the harvest, that they ought to have access to the commons, and so on and so on. And but involved in this is a notion of, as I say, a more humane notion of human need, which they are defending in a sense, which he calls their moral economy. The arguments I want to have with Thompson really begin with the last couple of chapters in his book, because here he poses issues which are not so much about the struggle, the customary struggle as he calls it sometimes, between labour and property, as much as issues where custom is used in the self-regulation, the self-management, you might say also, by local communities. And he describes in the last but one chapter a very strange custom, and in the final chapter another strange custom. One of these is called the sale of wives, and the other is called rough music. And I'll try and describe each of these to you first, just to get a sense of what he's talking about. In the first one, and any of you who've ever read The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy will remember the scene perhaps, A man leads a woman, his wife, into a marketplace, a small market town on market day. And he leads her in with a rope round her neck or round her waist. And he stands her up and he says, I'm selling this woman. Who will give me money for this woman? And he may make a speech about what a good woman she is and how hardworking she is, or what a beautiful woman she is, or whatever it may be. But he tries to sell her. He auctions her in the marketplace. And a crowd gathers around, and they may shout, and they may heckle, and they may jeer, and they may have had a few pints, and the whole thing is a very strange occasion. And finally, somebody from the crowd says, I'll give you 6pence for her. He says, not enough, not enough. And then somebody else says, I'll give you 10 shillings. And he says, gone to the man in the moleskin trousers. And it's sold, the sale is made, and you go off to the pub, and the 10 shillings is paid, and they sign a piece of paper. And they then drink the 10 shillings in a celebration of this occasion. And what he's talking about, of course, is a form of popular divorce. Because in the Mayor of Casterbridge, unlike most of the cases that Thompson digs out, in the Mayor of Casterbridge, the man sells his wife to a stranger. Normally, what actually was happening is that he was selling the woman to her lover. Actually, it's a way of publicly demonstrating, in a sense, the change in the relationship. It's a very humiliating occasion very often for the participants, but it is one in which a popular divorce is registered, in a sense, in a local community, using the language of the marketplace to carry this through. That's one kind of custom that he describes. And it seems very barbaric and very strange, perhaps, to us. Although, if you look at our divorce courts, perhaps it seems less barbaric and strange. The other one he describes is what he calls rough music. I think the French, I don't know how you pronounce it, but the French word for it is charivari. And here, a crowd of people from a local community gathers outside somebody's house, perhaps armed with things like pots and pans and other ways of things for making noise, and they had firecrackers, no doubt they'd use firecrackers, and they make a great din outside somebody's house to express the community's disapproval of the moral behaviour of somebody in that house, either all the people in that house or a particular person in that house. They may also carry that person in effigy through the town. They may even, if they can get hold of them, carry the person themselves through the town, attached to a pole. They may tip them into a pond, etc., etc. But the community is expressing its feeling against something that this person has done. It happened, Thompson met somebody who had come across such a thing in a northern industrial town in the early 1900s. Remembered it from his childhood and referred to it as devil's magic. When devil's magic had come to a town in Yorkshire. Now, who gets attacked in rough music demonstrations? Basically, it's people who've offended against popular morality and popular custom. People who've been thieves, for example, in the local community. A man who's been a wife beater or a child beater. A woman who's been a husband beater, known as a scold. As somebody who, in terms of the norms of the community, is seen as a sexual deviant, so a homosexual might be attacked in this sort of ritual. An older man who's married a younger woman may be attacked, with the young men of the town or the village leading the attack out of jealousy, and so on. We can see these sorts of practices. They existed in the 18th century, as Thompson describes them, but actually they're not only found in the 18th century, we also see them in similar things in the 19th century and in the 20th century, in the past and also in the present. Some of them we find wonderful and admirable, and some of them we find horrifying. I'll give you some examples alternately, if you like. In the Russian Revolution, workers carried their foremen out of the factories in wheelbarrows and tipped them into the local canal, for example. It's not unlike rough music. In Russia, there were also pogroms, which had an element of rough music, of the section of the community turning on another section of the community, the most filthy racism against the Jews, for example. You can see it in the shape of racist attacks in the East End of London, and other parts of this country, and in Europe, on immigrants' homes, rough music. We can see it in the Ku Klux Klan, lynching blacks in the South, very rough music. We can see it also, the other side of it, in the Gdynia shipyards in the middle of the Solidarity struggle in 1980, when the workers occupied the dockyards, they decided that there was to be no thieving. And then they caught workers who stole cigarette cartons from the docks, and they made them stand on pallets with notices around their necks saying thief. And then they would go by and hoot at them. And that was their punishment, they said, for thieves. A kind of proletarian justice being expressed in the middle of a great workers' uprising. Or, I think it was only about 10 days ago I read in The Guardian about a picket organised by one of the Jewish organisations of David Irving, the Nazi historian, of his house, protesting at him and his activities over Goebbels' diaries. It's a form, again, it's the same tradition, rough music. Or indeed, if you think of any, I think there's been more of this kind of activity in the United States and Canada than here, but we've had our share of pickets and counter-pickets at abortion clinics. You know, the lifers going to picket to try and shut down abortion clinics and us going to defend them, and if you like, two sorts of rival rough music occurring, and sometimes the most entertaining slogans, and actually they had rotten slogans, we have excellent slogans. I heard a couple from Canada last night, somebody saying, the Canadian comrades and the American comrades marching along in Buffalo together shouting, you say don't fuck, we say fuck you. Or another lovely one which was, sorry, this is utterly irrelevant to E.P.Thompson, but in a way not. A baby's not a baby until it comes out, that's what birthdays are all about. Real hard line, that one, I thought, excellent. But you can see the same sort, you know, the demonstrations in the case of the abortion clinic things, two sides, both engaging in the same kind of popular demonstration on questions of popular morality, questions of custom, of what's the appropriate way to behave, and so on. The question I want to pose really is what political attitude do we take to custom and these kinds of things? And I want to express a doubt and a disagreement about the way that E.P.Thompson, great historian that he is, and great socialist historian that he is, handles these questions. Because when he comes to discuss this question, he is deeply ambivalent about it. I mean, he makes all sorts of absolutely correct points. He says the last thing we should assume is that something, a custom like rough music, is always pleasant and nice and liberal and tolerant and so on. Far from it. It can be extremely vicious, as some of the examples I've mentioned. I mean, I can't think of anything much more vicious than the Ku Klux Klan lynching our black comrades in the southern states of the United States of America in history. It can be vicious, it can be horrible, right-wing, and so on in the extreme. And yet you also have to say, and he also says, this is a case of self-government by a community. The most horrible sort of self-government by the community in terms of its content, you can say, but it is a form of self-government by a community. And I think we have to say, firstly, that custom and tradition and popular morality and so on are themselves inherently immensely contradictory phenomena. In the same way, I mean, one of the things that struck me as a sort of analogy is when the great Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci talks about common sense in the population. He says, on the one hand, if you look at the common sense of the ordinary people, the workers and peasants of Italy, he says, they combine the mentality of the caveman, he says, and the most advanced philosophy in a terrific contradictory combination. And it seems to me we can think about custom in the same kind of way. Now, the problem with E.P.Thompson, I want to argue, is that he tends to uphold against custom not better custom, but rather an alternative method of regulation, of control over people, which is law. And he, in another book written in the 1970s called Whigs and Hunters, it was a famous and appalling passage, in my view, in which he wrote he wrote a defense of the rule of law, which he called, and I quote, an unqualified human good. An unqualified human good. And in the same passage in which he made this statement, he was writing in the aftermath of the great upsurge of the late 1960s and early 1970s. It was already, in reality, we would say that the downturn, perhaps looking back, had started by then, and perhaps he... rough music. in a period in which also, in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a rediscovery of all kinds of revolutionary ideas. And Thompson, against a mood of revolutionary optimism at Warwick University, where he was, where the SWP or the IS was in fact growing and our ideas were growing and so on, he said, against revolutionary optimism, he said, he advised his readers not to accept ideas that one day there would be a world where workers would run everything and so on and so on and so on. He said, I would advise you all, he says to his readers, to wait a century or two before you cut your hedges down. Now, it's an extraordinary image for a historian of the enclosures to use. The way the hedges and fences were indeed in the very history that he is a great historian of, a symbol of the dominance of property and the rights of property over human need. So it must have been a very conscious image for him to have chosen. Now, of course, Thompson's defense of the rule of law is extremely useful in one setting. When we are trying to defend people's civil rights, where already there is something established in the legal system and people are given rights and we are defending their rights, then Thompson is absolutely with us and we are completely with Thompson on such matters. For example, the defense of immigrants and refugees against the attacks on their rights which come in such things as the asylum bill, in all the bills across Europe and the acts across Europe to establish Fortress Europe. We are completely for the defense of rights, for the defense of previous laws against new laws, and so on and so on. We are, of course, for the defence of the jury system against attacks on it in Northern Ireland and various lawyers and police officers and the rest of it who tried to restrict the jury system. Of course, we defend civil rights, there's no question. And we find, and many of the things that Thompson wrote in the late 70s and in the 80s on this question, where he saw civil rights being under attack, we just solidarise with him completely. No question. But I want to argue it's not sufficient for us to simply say we defend the rule of law, because it doesn't ask what the law is. And this, it seems to me, Thompson, in the end, reveals himself, I think, to be, if you like, a colleague of Tony Bennett, a left reformist on this question. You see, there is more to law than simply saying justice and rights and so on, or rational procedures for deciding disputes and the rest of it. There's a very good discussion of the question by a Marxist anthropologist from America, who I think has died a few years ago, a man called Stanley Diamond, in which he wrote an essay about the opposition between law and custom. Custom is the thing I want to focus on, but he suggested that law historically has been not simply something that went along with custom. Historically, it's been opposed to custom. That law, he said, the growth of law has always been attached to the growth of the power of the state. If you say the rule of law, you also always say in practice the rule of the state. Custom is, and was, custom always is, one of the characteristics of custom, whether we like the custom or we hate the custom is always the property of the people who embody the custom. There is no custom separate from those who live it, in a sense, and work with it and use it. There is no Christmas except through us, in a sense. There are no birthdays except through us. These are customs, right? There is no rule. There's a very strong rule in our society. If you go drinking with a group of friends, then you take your turn to buy the beers. Now, you don't get arrested, it's true, if you don't take your turn, but there's custom that you'll get kicked to hell if you don't, and called a mean bastard and nobody go drinking with you. There's a communal regulation about these matters. I see people indicate looking at their friends seriously at this moment. You see, it's Engels, of course, in The Origins of the State, Family, Private Property and the State, says that the rise of the state is the defeat of a society that governed itself completely by custom, what he called the Gentile constitution. We lost our self-government, in a sense, with the rise of the state. Before state societies, before class societies, in other words, human society ran itself entirely on the basis of custom. Now, you have to say that law, in other words, is not the same as justice. Not the same as justice. Justice has always existed. You cannot say the word society without including in it some notion of justice. It may be a notion of justice you loathe, but every time you find human society, you find rules about what is proper behaviour, rules about how to handle people's deviations from what is seen in the society as proper behaviour. You can't have society without moral rules and means of handling offences against moral rules. Now, those who defend the state, who defend the rule of law, say, I mean, E.P.Thompson doesn't go this far, but the implication of the defence of the rule of law, it seems to me, does involve this. Those who defend the state say, if it wasn't for the state, society would collapse into disorder and anarchy. I mean, there's a very interesting discussion by numbers. I haven't read Audrey's book yet on the police, but maybe she doesn't particularly discuss this question, but there's an interesting series of writings have been done by people who've looked at the police and what the police's own picture of the world is like. And one of the things that characterises the police picture of the world is that they see society endlessly in danger of slipping into anarchy. It hasn't quite done so yet, but if it wasn't for the thin blue line of the police force, it would indeed slip into chaos and anarchy. And only they know it. And they have to be empowered, therefore, to protect innocent, ignorant society against the danger of anarchy and danger that only they really understand. And so, like Judge Dredd in the comics, you know, have in fact to be empowered to go around arresting, executing, beating people up, fixing confessions, etc., etc. They are the justified defenders of society, and they must be empowered by society which is ignorant and innocent and doesn't realise how much danger it faces, because only they really know. They set themselves up. I mean, in the police's own picture of their own world, they set themselves up as a more knowing elite that must be empowered over society. Of course, then one has to say, when one looks at actual states in history, firstly, they are terribly ineffective in preventing the very things that, you know, the one thing you cannot say about the British police, whatever else you say, is that they're effective. You know, I can't remember what it is, over 90% of all crimes they can't solve. The crime rate goes up. Every time you spend more money on the police, the crime rate goes up. It seems to be, you know, it causes it almost. There's a clear correlation between increasing money on police and more break-ins. It's quite clear that there's some connection between the two things. Secondly, of course, it ignores the fact that the greatest crimes in history have all been perpetrated not by customary crowds dancing outside somebody's house or throwing somebody in a pond or even lynching people, but of course the great crimes have been committed by states. I mean, I don't think that any lynch mob has ever managed to do anything like Hiroshima. I don't think that any crowd gathering in streets has ever managed to achieve anything like the Holocaust, or the system of the Gulag, or the First World War, or the Second World War, or, you know, when you look at the great crimes, the great murders of history, and so on, the great disorders of history, it's always associated with class society and above all, the state system of class society. Those who defend the state against popular justice, in the end, it seems to me, always end up with an elitist, class-based position that essentially they always are saying in the end that the only place in society where reason is to be found is at the top. And the bottom of society is indeed, exactly as it says, the bottom, an unthinking part that is to be kept sat upon. You know, that's the image of society always eventually involved, and I think that E.P.Thompson falls into this trap to some degree. Now, I want to argue two things, and you see that I'm aware of, I may not have got it right, and I'll be interested to hear really but I think there's something in what I have to say, and I'll be interested to see whether comrades can put it better, correct me, etc., etc. The first argument I want to make is that within custom, the kinds of customs that E.P.Thompson is describing, the customs we can think about in our own society, within popular morality, etc., etc., we can see not just the history of society, but actually the future of society. We can also see intimations of a future classless and stateless society. That's why, undoubtedly, he thinks I'm an anarchist. Secondly, that we can see in custom and everyday morality and so on, a field for political intervention. It's not something we should take. Custom is not something that is fixed and traditional and never changes. It is itself a field in which there is enormous space for political intervention, and that actually the only people who really understand this properly tend to be revolutionary socialists. And it is a particular field of importance for our activity for revolutionary socialists. Let me try and develop these two ideas. What is it about custom that makes it of interest to us? Looking at it politically, rather than just as a historian, if you like. The first thing, it seems to me, customs, as I suggested, belong to the participants directly. Consider the ritual of the wife sale. The man leading his wife into the marketplace and selling her in an auction. Now, I suspect that quite a lot of comrades here would find this a rather degrading ritual, right? You decide to split up with your partner, and you go and flog her at Marxism. I think that probably comrades would feel this is a bit off, right? I haven't noticed anybody flogging, their male or female partner, with a rope round the neck. Any bids for this comrade from, I don't know, Southwark branch or something, very good paper seller, etc., etc. Is it degrading? Well, perhaps it is. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was. In the circumstances of the time, perhaps we actually, if we projected ourselves back in some time machine, we'd find it degrading. What do we do about it? It seems to me, like the people who were there, as Thompson is wonderful because he gives you the material to discuss it. He gives you lots and lots of examples and beautiful, wonderful, lively writing. And he's dug away in obscure files and dug things out, and you get enough material to work with. And you can see that people played with this ritual. Some people went along and heckled. Some people who were involved in it refused to play. The wife wouldn't join in. Or the wife demanded to be sold and the husband refused. Or the bloke who was supposed to buy her didn't turn up. All sorts of things happened. The crowd jeered and they hissed and they sympathised with the woman. Women from the crowd would shout out, "Don't cry, my dear, it'll be all right," and this sort of thing. Also, the audience was part of the ritual. It was part of it belonged to all the people participating in it. They made of it what they could in terms of what their own understandings of what was right and proper and just in the circumstances of that time. They execrated the husband or they execrated the wife and so on. And perhaps it was very messy and very painful as a procedure, but then talk to people who've gone through anybody who's gone through anything like the breakup of a relationship that had any kind of standing over time, a divorce or whatever. At least they didn't pay lawyers fat fees and they didn't have to tell lies to judges. I remember, I won't say who it was, but I was a witness once for, let's say a friend, at his divorce. And I knew that he had come to the divorce court from his ex-wife's bed. That day, right? And there's me standing up in the court and saying to the judge, of course, a completely irrevocable breakdown, etc., etc. They didn't want to be married to each other anymore. But you had to lie to the judge because no question, if I told the truth about the relationship, the judge wouldn't be given the divorce. So people lie, and then the lawyer had to be paid a fat fee for misrepresenting the truth, etc., etc. At least in the case of the market sale, nobody, it cost 10 bob, and you drank the profits anyway. So it was, you all got to get a drink out of it. It was degrading, perhaps, it was unpleasant, but tell me a good way of handling these things that isn't, in reality. You see, it seems to me, I want to argue really that custom is, because it, in a way I want to argue, even when it's at its most horrible, it belongs to us in a way that the state doesn't. It's open to a kind of constant process of amendment and development and argument inside it. That customary practices and so on are a very open form of handling problems, all kinds of problems of disorder and division in society. And it's quite clear that as society changes and develops, custom is not, custom always sounds, and tradition always sound as if they're fixed. Actually, they're not. They're very flexible and they change all the time. One example, consider the way in which over the last generation, sexual mores in our society have changed, particularly as regards premarital sexual activity. I was a student in the early 60s, and the university I was at, a female student was caught in bed with a male student. And the female student was expelled from the university for this, and the male student was suspended. It was the judge, I was a lefty, and I think I reflected the period of the time like most people. We absolutely thought it was terrible, there was double standard, and we thought the bloke should have been sent down from the university as well. I don't take that position now, right? There were two people at the university when I was there who had a child out of wedlock and went around boasting about it. And we thought they were just too avant-garde. We were very pleased we knew them. Fancy knowing somebody as daring as that, the fantastic way in which sexual practices, and actually there's still an argument going on, between mums and their daughters and generations and within generations about it. But the way in which there's been a tide of change in everyday morality, it's something that changes. It's something as in an area of great sensitivity in all sorts of ways, and people get very hurt about these questions. The rules have changed in our society. Almost, there was never a campaign in some senses. They changed almost, on the wing, without not great battles over the question. I can't remember the great political battle over whether unmarried people could live together. There were thousands and thousands of individual battles, hundreds of thousands of them. Up and down the country, the rules changed, similarly in relation to unmarried mothers and so on and so on. Thompson has a very nice example himself of this kind of change. That in the 18th century, he says, there were lots of rough music demonstrations outside the houses of women who were called scolds. That's to say, they used to boss their husbands around and beat their husbands up and so on. And he says, comes the end of the century, you begin to detect a shift. And he describes one demonstration in Glamorgan, where the men went off to shout outside the house of a woman who was called a scold, and the women counter-demonstrated. Right? It became then an argument inside the community. Somebody amongst the women said, let's not go along with this crap anymore. Let's go and oppose the men. Good for her. You know, he's a miserable bleeder, and so on and so on. He deserves what he gets, etc. Well, let's stand up for strong women who assert their rights in the household and so on. There's a shift in all kinds of ways within the framework of custom. You see, there's no question, there's no way in which we can say that customary behaviour and customary morals and so on have not included the most appalling things. I mean, you can't pretend that this is not the case. You have to say that everyday culture is riven with all sorts of contradictions and so on. But what is wrong with it is not that it's customary and not that it's popular culture, but its content. It is not the form that's the problem, it's the content. It's the, if you like, the political and the moral ideas embedded in it which are the problem. And they are open to amendment and argument. And you see, in this area, really I've come to wind up, that poses the issue for us, it seems to me. How do you fight these things when you hate them? You see, take the question of racist attacks, for example. We can treat racist attacks as custom. Dreadful, horrible custom, embedded in people's prejudices and morals and so on, in the community. Do we say, let's rely on the state and the law to handle the question of racist attacks? We may be forced sometimes out of defensiveness to do so, but actually we know from the experience of things like the Anti-Nazi League and the rest of it, that actually the most effective way is to work directly on the ground amongst the people who are involved in that community, to try to isolate the racists, for example, to mobilize opinion against them, to try and turn the tide of custom and tradition and popular morality and the rest of it in a particular community, to oppose the racists, to seek to isolate them. And so on, to mobilize local people and the rest of it, to argue, to picket, to demonstrate, and if necessary, to fight physically, because that is also a perfectly customary activity. You know, the punch-up is part of custom, whereas strafing people from aircraft is not. You know, treating racism, we have to treat racism as a winnable issue, in other words, not as something that, you know, you've got to have a law against it, but actually it's a winnable issue in any working class community, in a factory, on a housing estate, or anywhere else. It seems to me that we have to recognise all the time, not be despondent about these things, treat matters to do with custom and habit and tradition and so on as open to development, open to argument, open to being won. I mean, I was advised when I first drafted my review to go back and read Trotsky. I've forgotten to read Trotsky. Trotsky's Problems of Life. I don't know if it's still in print. It's a beautiful pamphlet which Trotsky wrote in the early 20s, about the horrible customs and habits of Russian workers and peasant families and so on. And his attitude to it is exemplary. He doesn't talk about let's introduce new laws and the rest of it. He talks about the way in which you've got to grapple with the question directly by bringing matters to the light of day that are hidden, exposing in the press with articles and stories and so on, the tales of a horrible way, what happened to a child who was badly treated by her parents, a horrible way in which husbands treat their wives in Russia. Bring these matters out into the open, discuss them, argue about them. They are changeable. That seems to me absolutely right. Use politics to win not the abolition of morality, not the abolition of customs, but more advanced customs, more civilized customs, more socialistic, if you like, customs and mores and traditions and so on. Because in the end, it seems to me that our argument, I'll stop at this point, is that a socialist society is one where there will be less state law, even in a workers' state, there will be less state law and more reliance on custom. More reliance on tradition, more reliance on everyday morality, and so on and so on. More space for the civilized development, if you like, for popular custom and morality and the rest of it. And a socialist society, in the end, will be as good, not as the leadership of that society, but as good as the wisdom and the stupidity, the mixture of the wisdom and the stupidity, and the level of culture or development of the people who make it up. Andy only got a scattering of applause for that. Well, I'm going to thank comrades for a very interesting discussion, I think, because I can't really, I'm not going to be able to respond to all that's been said. The first, I mean, there was a point which was made in different ways by a number of comrades from the floor that one might say that what I had said had been too abbreviated, that in some ways I was not discussing, as actually Thompson does beautifully, particularly when, I think throughout his book, he has got a fantastic sense of the particular historical context in which he's discussing particular customs, and the way in which they are shaped by ruling class influences, also by, if you like, sort of emerging anti-capitalist impulses amongst a growing working class in England and so on. And any particular custom or habit or morality or whatever that we might be talking about in our society, we also have to look at with that sense of where it belongs in terms of the class struggle, the influences of ruling class ideas on it, the other possibilities sometimes found within things, possibilities for the future, and so on. Because certainly I very much agree with those comrades, for example, Lindsay talking about the double-edged character of the Los Angeles riots. I thought that was absolutely right. Similarly, the comrade who used the phrase two-sidedness when talking about customs and so on. There is the sense in which the orthodox ruling class assumptions of everyday society feed into the way that people live their customs and live their moral life and everyday life in society. Also, within it, there are all sorts of seeds of potential opposition to the way that things are, and so on. If there weren't, we'd have a much more difficult life, actually, in terms of our politics, than in practice we do. It may be hard, but it would be a bloody sight harder if there was nothing but ruling class ideas in people's heads. Of course, I mean, the title In Praise of Custom, I'm not wanting to simply say, and I would be sorry if that was misunderstood on this question, that simply we sit down and we say, oh goody, it's a custom, isn't that good, and isn't that quaint, and isn't that historical, or isn't that wonderful, you know, look at the lovely things that people do, and so on, because there's no question, of course, I mean, I may be an anarchist, but I'm a Marxist anarchist, and certainly a revolutionary anarchist, if not, maybe denied the title of Marxist. We have to fight against sexism and racism, for example. The issue, though, it seems to me, is in part about how we fight against those things, and we actually have to, the most effective struggle that we conduct is amongst the mass of the population against those things. I find it very, very pleasing that in Britain today, those people who carry out attacks on the homes of Asians and others in this country have to do so secretively, because it has not always been the case that that was so. If you look at the period of the last period of the rise of the Nazis in Germany, there were areas of the country in which Jews actually found themselves under assault in their homes, not organised by the bloody cops, but actually by people in the local population, undoubtedly including Nazis, but let's be also clear, not Nazis who were state officials and the rest of it, but rank-and-file Nazis who had mobilised their local populations, particularly in the rural areas and the small towns, into the most vicious activity. The question is, what would you do if you were there? You'd have to engage in trying to mobilise counteraction to them and defence of those of the local Jewish people, but the place to do it would precisely be amongst ordinary working people, and that would be the most effective way of doing it. It's precisely the kind of way in which we work. But thank God they are secretive, because they haven't got a mass following. It's very important that we haven't lost the argument. In a sense, they have to do it in a hidden way. And it isn't just because of the state, it is fundamentally because they know actually that the great majority of the British population is not in favour of bombing Asians' homes and the rest of it. Of course there could be backward pandering to customs and so on. I'm not arguing for that. What I was trying to get, and I'm not sure that I've got it right, I'm not going to pretend that, but it seems to me that we need a sense of the contradictory character that Gramsci talked about, the contradictory character of popular consciousness, of popular organisation, popular custom, popular morality, and the points at which, therefore, it's capable of being intervened in. And actually, I still want to suggest that, having said all that, that there is something about custom and popular morality and the rest of it that does offer us something about the future as well as about the past, because it is, in the end, about issues about people making up their own minds about how their society should be organised, which are very valuable to us and very unvaluable to the ruling class who would like to tell us what to do and what to think. But that whole tradition of a field of argument going on in society about how life should be lived, all the things that we're discussing in other meetings, I think of the meeting, for example, Why Do Men Rage? We have a much more sophisticated account of that, a concrete account, that has a sense of the complexity and the contradiction in the situation than some bloody judge in a court, who can't really understand the thing at all, or some bloody Tory MP, who may also be opposed to rape, though some of them are clearly not, but will not handle the question in the way that we I believe, can, precisely because we look at it in terms not only of the suffering of women, but also the suffering of men in our society. I'll just end with one last, since the question of contradiction was raised and the question of Irish Catholicism was raised, I'll end with the splendid sense of the contradiction of custom. I have a comrade, there's a comrade in Manchester who told us a story that, a couple of weeks ago about when he became an atheist. And he went to the priest and confessed that he'd become an atheist.